We're going to discover the rules it follows to build entire worlds right from the ground up. Okay, let's just dive right into the heart of the mystery. Have you ever really stopped to think about why our planet is absolutely covered in green? Just carpets of plants everywhere. But seeing a top predator, like a lion or a bald eagle, is such a rare event. I mean, it seems a little backward, right? Kind of counterintuitive. But this isn't some kind of accident or imbalance. It's actually a fundamental rule of how life works. And it's all governed by this hidden structure that we can actually see and map out. And that structure is called an ecological pyramid. It's a concept that was first described by the ecologist Charles Elton way back in the 1920s as a way to show how ecosystems are organized. Now, you can look at an ecosystem in a few different ways. You could count every single organism, or you could weigh them all. That's biomass. But the real secret, the key to solving our puzzle, lies in the pyramid of energy. That's the one that shows us the engine driving the whole system. So what does that actually mean? Well, it's pretty simple, really. It just shows that the producers, the plants that make their own food, form this massive base. And then each level above it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to the very top. Okay, to put some real numbers on this, let's take a look at a grassland. At the very bottom, you could have a truly staggering 6 million individual grass plants. And all of that life, all 6 million of those plants, can ultimately only support a tiny number of top carnivores. In this case, just 3. I mean, from 6 million down to 3. How is that even possible? What on earth is going on here? Well, the answer comes down to energy. And there's a simple but absolutely unbreakable rule known as Lindemann's 10% law. You can think of it as nature's very strict budget. Think about your own paycheck. Most of it goes to essentials, right? Rent, food, just living. Well, it's the exact same for every organism. The vast majority of the energy it takes in is used up just to move, to grow, and to stay warm. Only a tiny piece is left over to pass on. Okay, so let's do a little math. Let's imagine we start with a nice big round number, 1 million joules of energy from the sun, all hitting a field. Now, you'd think plants are these super efficient solar panels, right? But not really. They only manage to convert about 1% of all that sunlight into food they can actually use. So just like that, our million joules of sunlight becomes only 10,000 joules of plant energy. That's a 99% drop right at the very start. And now that 10% rule kicks in. An herbivore comes along and eats those plants, but it only gets to store about 10% of their energy, a mere 1,000 joules. And it keeps going. The next predator that eats the herbivore, yep, it gets just 10% of that, which brings us all the way down to only 100 joules. And finally, by the time you get to the top predator, the one at the very apex of the pyramid, it's left with a measly 10 joules from that original million. And that right there is why there can only be a few of them. There's just not enough energy left to go around. Okay, so that explains the structure, but how does nature build this complex pyramid from nothing in the first place? Well, that brings us to this incredible dynamic process called ecological succession. So succession is basically nature's playbook for starting over. It's this amazing, predictable sequence of events where one community of life actually paves the way for the next and the next, until you get a stable, mature ecosystem. And it happens in these clear stages. First, you start with a bare, lifeless area. Then comes the invasion of tough pioneer species. Think lichens on a rock or hardy grasses. They're the first settlers. Their whole job is to change the environment, creating soil and adding nutrients. As more life arrives, competition heats up. And eventually, after all that change, the whole community starts to stabilize. And nature has 2 main strategies for this big comeback. You've got primary succession, which is building from absolute zero on bare rock. It is incredibly slow. And then there's the much faster secondary succession. That's what happens when an area is just disturbed, like by a forest fire, because the soil is already there, giving life a huge head start. So when you put these 2 huge ideas together, this rigid energy pyramid and this dynamic process of succession, you really start to see the world in a whole new light. It's a world built on both strict rules and amazing resilience. So the big takeaway here is this. Nature is built on 2 incredible truths. On one hand, you have these super strict, unbreakable laws of energy that limit how much life can exist at the top. But on the other hand, you have this amazing, built in plan for recovery and rebuilding from almost any disaster. And that really leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? Because human activities, things like deforestation or farming, they can kickstart this whole process of succession. We are not just watching this happen from the sidelines, we are active participants. So the real question is, what kind of ecosystems are we helping to create for the future?